English is not a single, uniform language. It is a highly fragmented ecosystem, heavily fractured by centuries of migration, forced relocation, and institutional control. This is Braj Khatru's three circles model, categorizing global English varieties. The mint green center is the inner circle, majority first language nations. Moving outward, the outer circle features post-colonial nations, where English is a secondary institutional language. Finally, the expanding circle uses English purely as a foreign language. Membership in the inner circle has nothing to do with phonetic purity. It is defined strictly by the presence of native speaker communities, a history of colonial settlement, and local institutional control over the language. Edgar Schneider's dynamic model maps a 5-stage timeline. Stage 1 is foundation, triggering language contact. In exonormative stabilization, the colony relies on the mother country's rules. Stage 3 is nativization, creating a hybrid language. Finally, during endonormative stabilization and differentiation, the nation codifies its own rules and regional dialects. This means American, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand Englishes are not corrupted versions of British English. They are the direct result of this completed evolutionary process. Even at its source, the English language is heavily fractured. Its origin on the British Isles involved continuous migration, warfare, and contact, starting with Germanic Anglo-Saxon invasions and layering through subsequent Norse and Norman conquests. Linguists measure this variation using tools like John Wells' standard lexical sets, shown here. By comparing sets of words like bath, trap, and strut, we map exact phonemic inventories and specific phonetic outputs across different regions. This mapping reveals an acute north-south dialect divide in England. These phonetic boundaries trace back to historical borders established near the River Humber in early written sources. In Wales, the indigenous Celtic substrate language survived and permanently altered the English spoken there. This historical isolation preserved a distinct intonation pattern, creating a characteristic sing-song effect driven by unique pitch ranges. Scottish English exhibits a heavily reduced vowel system with fewer diphthongs. It also retains highly unique non-standard vert morphology. Similarly, Irish English is deeply permeated by its own Gaelic substrate, resulting in localized grammatical structures and discourse markers that do not exist elsewhere. The British Isles base provides no single phonetic standard. It is a complex mosaic of ancient language contact and regional isolation. As the British Empire expanded, it exported this fragmented language through 4 main typologies of colonization: trade, settlement, plantation, and exploitation. American English is a direct product of settlement colonization. It underwent its own rigorous standardization process, favoring rhoticity, pronouncing the R, and discarding the centering diphthongs common in British pronunciation. Canadian English emerged as a linguistic hybrid. It shares American rhoticity and grammar, but because of its loyalist history, it actively preserves specific British spelling conventions, like spelling color with a U. In Australasia, late 18th century penal and rural settlement created a highly distinct phonetic profile. Extreme geographic isolation allowed Australian English vowels to mutate significantly away from their original British targets. While Australian English shares many vowel qualities with South African English, they are immediately distinguishable by specific phonetic shifts. For instance, Australia utilizes front vowels, where South Africa relies on back vowels. New Zealand English was heavily shaped by its foundational contact with the indigenous Maori language. This early cultural intersection localized the dialect and heavily influenced its modern lexicon. When geographical separation forces a language to adapt to new flora, fauna, and indigenous populations, lexical borrowing and phonetic divergence are the biological inevitabilities of that language. In the Caribbean, we observe a Creole continuum, visualized by this gradient slider. Speakers code switch fluidly between a highly localized Creole, known as the Basilect, and a standard English variety, the Acrolect, depending entirely on their social context. This linguistic continuum was born directly out of the brutal conditions of plantation colonization. The exploitative labor systems and forced language shifts among enslaved African populations drove severe language contact and immediate Creole formation. Liberia presents a unique inner circle anomaly. It is a West African nation settled in the 19th century by freed American slaves. Because of this specific migration, modern Liberian English linguistically mirrors 19th century African American vernacular English, preserved almost completely intact as a phonetic time capsule. Other highly isolated island communities retain archaic English features, vowels and grammar structures that have long since died out in London or New York. English variation is a direct record of human power dynamics, forced migrations, and extreme isolation over the last 400 years. This brings us to the concept of Standard English. It is strictly an abstract, codified sociolinguistic construct maintained by institutions, publishers, and the elite. Crucially, Standard English is a dialect, a set of rules for grammar and vocabulary. It is not an accent. It can be spoken perfectly with a Scottish, American, or Australian accent, despite the historical gatekeeping of codified broadcasting norms. Even the major national standards disagree on basic pronunciation. The division between rhotic and non-rhotic accents proves that a single global standard pronunciation is a myth. The statistical reality is that native speakers of English are now a minority of global users. Most English communication happens between non-native speakers, utilizing English as a lingua franca for critical international operations. Teaching a singular, idealized native speaker model ignores the comparative linguistic data of the inner circle and the practical reality of modern global communication. For the ELT classroom, this requires practical applications. Educators must implement multi-accent listening exercises to build international proficiency. Students should analyze textbooks to identify regional bias regarding Standard English. Finally, classrooms must debate accent prestige to identify linguistic bias in professional settings. For Vietnamese classrooms to effectively prepare students for the global economy, they must fully integrate this World English's framework. To ensure students are fully prepared for modern global English assessments, partner with the experts. Brought to you by the IELTS Focus.